Season 1 of You follows Joe Goldberg, a bookstore manager in New York who becomes obsessed with aspiring writer Guinevere Beck and begins manipulating her life in the hopes of developing a relationship. As Joe fantasizes about being in a relationship with Beck, he justifies to himself all of the horrific things he's willing to do for love as necessary. Joe breaks into Beck's apartment to snoop around and learn more about her, and stalks her throughout her day to keep tabs on her. When a drunken Beck falls into the subway tracks, it's Joe that is miraculously there to save her. He even steals her phone so he can monitor conversations she has once getting a new one. The first major obstacle in Joe's way of winning Beck's heart is her on-again off-again boyfriend Benji. Due to Benji being a bit of a tool, Joe feels completely justified in attacking him and locking him up in the vault in his bookstore's basement. Eventually, Joe realizes there's no good way out of this situation and is forced to kill Benji. He covers up this act by burning Benji's body and making it appear that he has simply run off. Following Benji's murder, Joe and Beck enter into a relationship, but another obstacle presents itself. Beck's best friend Peach is suspicious of Joe and is similarly obsessed with Beck and manipulating her to bend Beck to her wants. A jealous Joe hits Peach on the head with a rock and leaves her for dead, but unfortunately for Joe, she survives the attack. Not sure that it was Joe that attacked her, but still very much suspicious, Peach invites Beck over to her family estate for a getaway, with plans to whisk Beck off to live together in Paris. Beck turns down the offer, realizing that Joe was correct about Peach's manipulative ways, and leaves the estate. Joe then kills Peach and frames it as self-inflicted due to heartbreak. With Peach now out of the picture, Joe and Beck are finally free to be together with no more distractions, and that lasts for a few months. Beck grows secretive and distant, which only further fuels Joe's jealousy and possessiveness. He begins to suspect that Beck is cheating on him with her therapist, Dr. Nicky, and even begins seeing the therapist himself using an alias. Eventually, Joe confronts Beck about her relationship with the therapist, and hurt that Joe doesn't trust her, Beck breaks up with him. 3 months later, Joe is doing his best to move on. Aside from stalking Beck, Joe has looked after Paco, the young son of his drug addict neighbor Claudia. Claudia's boyfriend is an abusive parole officer named Ron who is constantly picking fights with Claudia, Paco, and Joe. Joe then enters into a relationship with Karen, Claudia's friend, and the two help Claudia get clean. But try as he might to convince himself that Karen is right for him, Joe just can't seem to get over Beck. Similarly, Beck isn't over Joe, and so Joe breaks up with Karen and reunites with Beck, making them seemingly stronger than ever. But when a spiteful Karen tells Beck that Joe will always be pining over his other ex, Beck begins to look into Joe's previous relationship with the mysterious Candace. Beck discovers that Candace was an ex-girlfriend of Joe's that seemingly went completely off the grid following their breakup and hasn't contacted friends or family in years. Beck grows concerned that something sinister is at play with Joe and that Candace may have even been murdered. And Beck should be concerned, as Joe had previously killed a man named Elijah after discovering that Candace was having an affair with him. Mr. Mooney, the original owner of the bookstore Joe manages and a father figure that mentally abused him as a child, helped Joe cover up Elijah's death. Although Joe is able to come up with a reasonable explanation for Candace's disappearance, all of his dark secrets are revealed when Beck discovers a hidden box in Joe's apartment filled with mementos of all of his previous crimes. Beck's original phone, Peach's phone, Benji's phone, even Benji's teeth. His violent ways exposed, Joe is left with no choice but to lock Beck up in the book vault until he can figure out a way to make their relationship work again. Beck pleads for her life and release, and eventually even suggests that Joe pin all of his crimes on Dr. Nicky. Back at his apartment building, the abusive Ron beats Claudia and puts her in the hospital. Joe is forced to kill Ron to protect Paco and explains to Paco what must be done to cover up this murder. As Joe deals with all of this, Beck uses a typewriter in the book vault to write her story, detailing all of Joe's horrific crimes and attributing them to Dr. Nicky instead. When Joe finally returns, Beck is able to convince him that she loves him and understands why he did everything that he did. She manages to lure Joe into the vault and locks him inside, but her escape plan is thwarted when she discovers that the basement door is also locked and a loyal Paco refuses to help her. In the end, Joe escapes the vault and finally kills Beck. 4 months later, the book Beck wrote in the vault is now a huge success. It also leads to the arrest of a framed Dr. Nicky, inadvertently exonerating Joe. But just as it looks like Joe will be able to get away with all of his past crimes, his ex-girlfriend Candace shows up, very much alive, to confront Joe over their unfinished business. In season 2 of You, Joe's past relationship with his ex Candace is revealed. After getting into a fight upon discovering that Candace was having an affair, Joe accidentally bludgeoned Candace's head. Thinking he'd killed her, Joe buried Candace's body and fled. But it turns out Candace wasn't dead and woke up after having been buried alive. She went to the police to have Joe arrested, but they unfortunately turned her away. And so now Candace has to get her own justice by making sure Joe's life is miserable and to stop him from ever hurting another woman. With Candace back in the picture, Joe flees New York City to hide out in Los Angeles. He locks up professional identity forger Will Bettelheim in a newly built book vault and assumes his identity. Then quickly secures himself a new apartment and a new job working in the book section of a trendy grocery store called Navrin. Proving to himself that he's a better changed man, Joe eventually releases the real Will Bettelheim from the book vault after he promises to remain quiet. Joe eventually finds a new object of his desire, Love Quinn, a recent widow from the wealthy family that owns Navrin. Unlike Beck, Love is quickly all in on her relationship with Joe right from the start, and it is Joe who is hesitant to pursue the relationship due to fearing it will lead Love to the same fate as Beck. But Joe eventually succumbs to his desires and engages in a relationship with Love. Complicating his relationship with Love is her own codependent relationship with her twin brother 40. 40 is a recovering addict and trust fund baby who dreams of being a famous writer and director, but lacks the drive and talent necessary to succeed. Soon Joe is roped into helping 40 write his next attempted film project, an adaptation of Guinevere Beck's book. And to make things with 40 even more complicated, Love's twin brother also begins dating a woman named Amy, who is actually Joe's ex-girlfriend Candace. Candace gets close to Love and warns her about Joe's violent nature, but unfortunately Love believes Joe when he claims that Candace is just a crazy, spiteful ex-girlfriend. Meanwhile, Joe also begins a friendship with his new teenage neighbor Ellie. When Ellie lands an internship with famous comedian Henderson, Ellie's older sister Delilah confides in Joe that Henderson has a history of sexually assaulting minors, including Delilah when she was younger. And so Joe goes into vengeful protector mode, confronting Henderson about his history of abuse. This confrontation ends with Joe accidentally pushing Henderson down a flight of stairs, which kills him, leading to yet another murder for Joe to cover up. Although the police determine that Henderson's death was accidental, Delilah's cop friend with benefits, Fincher, starts looking more into the case and begins to suspect Joe. This prompts Delilah to search Joe's apartment for evidence, which in turn prompts Joe to lock Delilah up in his book vault. Joe doesn't want to kill Delilah and leave Ellie an orphan, so he plans to release her and flee the country, leaving Love behind. But when Joe goes to the book vault the next morning, he finds that Delilah has been murdered. Candace arrives and locks Joe inside, then calls Love to the scene so she can prove once and for all that Joe is a murderer. But this plan backfires on Candace as Love murders her and confesses to Joe she also killed Delilah so that Joe's secret was safe and he wouldn't need to run away without her. And then Love reveals that she also killed her and 40's au pair when they were children, and that from the beginning she was manipulating Joe to make him fall in love with her, the same way he had previously done to Beck. This shatters Joe's image of Love and he even debates killing her, but Love reveals that she's pregnant, so Joe decides to try loving Love again so he can be with his baby. And although Love can forgive Joe for his past crimes, her twin brother 40 cannot, confronting the two of them and holding Joe at gunpoint. And that's when Officer Fincher arrives, shooting and killing 40. The murders of Henderson and Candace are then pinned on 40, and the Quinn family helps to cover up the crimes. Joe then gives the newly orphaned Ellie a stack of cash and promises to continue sending money as she runs off to start a new life. Now, with all of his roadblocks and issues resolved, Joe is free to be with Love, moving into a nice suburban house together in which they could raise their baby. But finding out Love is a murderer is not something Joe can so easily move past, and he's already got his sights set on his next object of desire, his new next door neighbor. In Season 3 of You, Joe and Love attempt to live in peaceful domestic bliss in the Madre Linda suburbs, but things quickly begin to unravel. Joe becomes obsessed with their new neighbor Natalie Engler and loses interest in his wife Love and their newborn child Henry. When Love discovers Joe's latest obsession, she murders Natalie. After helping Love dispose of Natalie's body, Joe and his wife attempt to cover up the murder while also ingratiating themselves into their new community. Joe is hired by a local librarian named Marianne to restore rare books, leading to her becoming Joe's newest obsession. When Joe discovers that Marianne's ex-husband Ryan was playing dirty to win custody of the couple's young child, Joe begins stalking him to figure out a way to help his new love. Eventually, Ryan catches Joe stalking him, forcing Joe to murder him. Meanwhile, Love opens up her own bakery and builds a new plexiglass vault in its basement. After discovering a local anti-vax man named Gil had inadvertently caused Henry to catch the measles, Love frames him for Natalie's murder. Love also befriends local mom influencer Sherry Conrad, who proposes that her and her husband Carrie enter into a swinging relationship with Love and Joe. Joe, looking for a way to end his marriage, agrees to the proposition. As Joe and Love continue their new sexual exploits with the Conrads, they accidentally expose their involvement in Natalie's murder. Joe and Love are forced to subdue the Conrads and lock them in the plexiglass vault, which the eccentric Conrads find to be arousing. As Love feels Joe pulling away to focus on his new obsession, she begins a new relationship of her own. Love meets and quickly becomes romantic with a young college student named Theo. Love soon discovers that Theo is in fact the stepson of Matthew Engler, husband of the murdered Natalie. Theo confides in Love that Matthew is skeptical that Gil is the real murderer and begins illegally surveilling the residence of Madre Linda. Although Matthew eventually gives up on his search, Theo does see video footage of Joe driving Natalie's car and races to the bakery to warn Love of her husband's crimes. At the bakery, Theo discovers the imprisoned Conrads, forcing Love to knock him out, although Joe does rescue him and bring him to the hospital. Love finally confronts Joe about his new obsession with Marianne, prompting Joe to ask for a divorce. Devastated by her husband's actions, Love paralyzes him with a drug known as aconite and then calls Marianne to their home, where she reveals to the librarian that Joe is a violent man who had murdered Ryan. After Marianne flees, Love attempts to kill her husband for his betrayal. Instead, Joe reveals that he has taken an antidote and then murders Love, frames her for all of the Madre Linda deaths, and burns their house to the ground. As the season comes to a close, Sherry and Carrie escape the vault, their marriage stronger than ever. The estranged Matthew and Theo reconcile, and Joe leaves his son Henry in the care of his co-worker Dante, before heading to Paris, France in search of Marianne. In Season 4 of You, Joe has successfully framed the string of Madre Linda murders on Love and faked his own death to freely stalk his latest object of desire, Marianne. When Joe tracks down Marianne and her daughter Juliet in London, Marianne is horrified and wants nothing to do with the murderous Joe. Wanting to prove he is a reformed and worthy man, Joe chooses to leave Marianne alone. Joe is then confronted by a hitman named Elliot, sent by Love's father to find and kill him. Instead, Elliot empathizes with Joe's desire to be a better man, giving him a passport with a new identity in exchange for the money Joe stole from Love's account, and for killing the only witness to Joe's current survival, Marianne. Joe can't bring himself to kill Marianne, so he instead steals her necklace to trick Elliot into thinking that she is dead. And with that, Joe is now free to live a new life in Europe as English professor Jonathan Moore. As Joe builds his new life in London, he develops feelings for Kate Galvin, the girlfriend of his obnoxious neighbor and fellow professor Malcolm Harding. At a party amongst the wealthy elites of the Sundry House, Joe meets and befriends the author Reese Montrose, Kate's socialite best friend Lady Phoebe, and Phoebe's wealthy American boyfriend Adam Pratt, who owns the Sundry House and secretly hires men to urinate on him. The next morning, Joe wakes up in a drunken haze and discovers that Malcolm has been murdered and is missing a finger. Thinking himself responsible, Joe quickly disposes of the body. But Joe is then shocked when he receives a text from the real killer, thanking him for his help and getting rid of the evidence. Joe then begins researching Malcolm in the hopes of discovering who murdered him. Amidst this investigation, a Nepo baby artist with a connection to Malcolm, Simon Sue, is similarly murdered and has his ear cut off, prompting the public to dub the murderer as the Eat the Rich Killer. Later, Joe returns home to discover that the killer has broken into his apartment, taunting him with the knowledge of his real identity. As Joe continues growing closer with Kate, the pair eventually begin a relationship. Adam's bodyguard Vic grows suspicious of Joe and follows him, finding Malcolm's ring, which had been planted on Joe to further frame him. And so, Joe is forced to kill Vic. The secret killer then demands that Joe murder Kate, but he refuses. Phoebe invites Joe and Kate to a weekend getaway at her family estate, where Joe becomes disgusted by the ways that Phoebe's friends and family mistreat their staff. Phoebe confesses her fears that Adam doesn't truly love her, while Adam plots to marry Phoebe to use her family's money to pay off his growing debts. During the getaway, Phoebe's friends Gemma and Rawd both accuse Joe of being the eat-the-rich killer, but as Joe tries to absolve himself of any guilt, he discovers that Gemma has been murdered, with Kate standing over her holding a knife. Kate professes her innocence and Joe believes her, helping her dispose of the body and theorizing that the mystery killer is now trying to frame them both. Rawd catches Joe disposing of Gemma's body and chases him through the woods with a shotgun. Joe manages to subdue Rawd but is then caught by the real killer, Reese, who came from poverty and wants to enact revenge against the wealthy elites who tried to keep him down. Reese locks up Joe and Rawd in the dungeon and demands that Joe kill Rawd to pin all of the murders on him. When Joe refuses, Reese sets the dungeon on fire and leaves both men to die. Joe rescues Rawd and escapes the dungeon, but keeps Reese's identity as the killer a secret to everyone, wanting to bring down the murderer himself. But that would be easier said than done, as Reese announces his decision to run for mayor of London. Reese then forces Joe to find a patsy to frame for all of the murders, and in doing so, Joe catches the suspicions of one of his students, Nadia, who begins investigating her professor. After successfully framing a woman named Dawn, Reese gives Joe one final task to complete, after which he will be left alone forever. Kill Kate's estranged father, Tom Lockwood, a major political donor for Reese's rival in the mayoral race. Lockwood arrives in London trying to reconcile with his daughter and convince her to take over his company, but due to her hatred for her father's corruption, Kate refuses. When Joe refuses to kill Lockwood, Reese kidnaps Marianne and threatens her life to force Joe into cooperating. As a reluctant Joe considers killing Lockwood, Kate's father secretly professes that he is aware of Joe's true identity and murderous past, and wants him to kill his political rival Reese. Thanks to Lockwood's help, Joe finds Reese and tortures him for Marianne's location. Strangely, Reese pleads his innocence and claims to not even know who Joe is. Furious by this, Joe murders the mayoral candidate, only to then realize that the Reese he has been interacting with is just a figment of his imagination, inspired by reading stories about the real Reese, who had a similar upbringing to Joe. Joe then remembers that he was in fact the one who had kidnapped Marianne and then suffered a psychotic break, leading to seeing visions of Reese, a manifestation of his darker impulses that goaded him into committing all of the murders. Meanwhile, the investigating Nadia discovers Joe's villainy and finds Marianne trapped in a new glass vault, promising to find a way to release Joe's newest victim. Joe keeps all of his newfound revelations to himself and continues his romance with Kate. The pair tried to convince Phoebe to not marry Adam, who is only after her money, but Phoebe refuses to listen, and so Lockwood sends hitmen to murder Adam, hoping that stopping the wedding would win his daughter's respect and agreement to take over their family company. But Kate remains bitter toward her father and refuses. As this season comes to a close, Joe becomes haunted by all of the women he has murdered before. Ultimately, he plots to free Marianne and end his cycle of violence by sacrificing himself. Instead, Joe finds Marianne has overdosed on a medication he had earlier left for her. Joe places Marianne's lifeless body in the park, staging her death as a regular overdose. But secretly, Marianne is actually alive and had plotted this ruse with Nadia to help her escape. Kate confides in Joe her hatred for her father, who has always secretly financially supported her despite their estrangement. And so Joe kills Lockwood before committing to his final plan to rid the world of his own evil desires. Joe is rescued and lives, where Kate informs him that she has inherited her father's business and covered up Joe's involvement in Reese's death at Lockwood's command. Having miraculously survived death, Joe then chooses to fully give in to his darker impulses, murdering Nadia's boyfriend Edward and framing her for the killing. In the end, Marianne moves back to Paris with her daughter Juliet, while Joe and Kate move back to New York City together, where Kate uses her new power and fortune to clear Joe's name and establish establish public support for him as a victim of Love Quinn's violent rampage. In Season 5 of You, 3 years have passed and Joe Goldberg is now beloved by the public and part of a power couple with Kate, and has even been reunited with his son Henry. As Kate tries to run her family's business better than her father ever did, she also tries to suppress Joe's darker impulses. At work, Kate is at odds with her half-sister Reagan, who believes the company's leadership should have been passed to her. Meanwhile, Reagan's twin sister Maddie is a carefree socialite who flirts with Joe, and Lockwood half-brother Teddy is a bit of an outcast from the rest of the family, and therefore chooses to support Kate and Joe due to their acceptance of him. When Joe discovers that Kate's uncle Bob has been leaking company secrets to the press in an attempt to have her ousted, Kate finally relents to Joe giving in to his true self. And so, Joe murders Bob and frames him for all of the Lockwood company's past crimes. Meanwhile, Joe returns to his old bookstore Mooney's, where he meets a young aspiring author named Bronte. Joe is immediately obsessed with Bronte, who seems like his dream girl come to life, and hires her to work for him. Joe's one rule is that Bronte is forbidden from entering the bookstore's basement, where Joe has stored all of his darkest secrets, including a newly built glass book vault. When Bronte disobeys the rules and reads all of Joe's dark secrets from his diaries, she assumes they are all works of fiction. Joe eventually discovers that Bronte is actually a possible grifter named Luis, who owes her ex-boyfriend Clayton a lot of money. As Joe grows closer to Bronte, he begins to fear that she is simply manipulating him for his money. Elsewhere, Henry gets into a fight with Reagan's daughter Gretchen, leading everyone to fear he has inherited his father's darkness. Instead, Henry confesses to Joe that he was simply standing up for his mother Love, who Gretchen mocked as a crazed murderer. When Joe and Kate confront Reagan, she accuses them of murdering Bob and demands that Kate step down as CEO. Despite Kate's objections, Joe kidnaps Reagan and locks her in the book vault. Unaware of Joe's actions, Kate declares her intentions to take down Reagan legally, and that killing Bob was a mistake that she deeply regrets. Realizing that Kate will never accept the real him, Joe continues to keep secret his kidnapping of Reagan, before unfortunately realizing that he had actually accidentally kidnapped her twin sister Maddie. As Joe tries to come up with a plan to resolve the Maddie situation without killing her, it is publicly exposed that she was having an affair with Reagan's husband Harrison. Kate comforts Reagan over the affair, helping the siblings reconcile, while Joe believes that Maddie can simply run off in peace with Harrison, solving all of their problems. Unfortunately, Maddie refuses, afraid that Reagan will take all of Harrison's money and claim sole custody of Gretchen, who also happens to be Maddie's daughter. But when Reagan begins posing as Maddie, giving up her Lockwood board seat, Joe realizes that Maddie could simply pose as Reagan, granting her the life she always wanted. Kate discovers that Reagan has been embezzling money from the company and moves to fire her, but Reagan reveals that she has proof of Joe murdering Bob. Reagan threatens to expose this evidence if Kate doesn't resign from the Lockwood company. Joe once again insists that he kill Reagan to solve all of their issues, but Kate is filled with remorse for all of her actions and instead plans to resign. Joe once again goes behind Kate's back, kidnapping Reagan and forcing Maddie to kill her, ensuring her complicity and silence. And so Maddie is released from the book vault and assumes Reagan's life, stepping away from the company and allowing Kate to remain as CEO. Kate knows that Joe is behind this supposed change of heart and confronts him, while Joe is shocked that his wife is not happy that he came to her rescue. Feeling spurned, Joe turns to Bronte and finally gives in to his lust for her, leading to the two having sex. Kate finally realizes that her husband is a violent man controlled by his evil impulses, and not, as she had wanted to believe, a good man willing to kill for those he loves. And so Kate reveals everything to Teddy, and the pair begin investigating Joe's past. Meanwhile, Maddie begins having a mental breakdown while living a double life as herself and Reagan. This leads to her confessing everything to Kate. Ultimately, Kate files for divorce from Joe, but wants their separation to be amicable for the sake of Henry. A distraught Joe then seeks comfort in Bronte, who he finds with her ex-boyfriend Clayton. Joe confronts Clayton for his harassment of Bronte, leading to a fight between the pair that ends with Joe killing Clayton. And that's when Bronte's friends reveal they've recorded the entire confrontation, revealing that as Louise, her plan all along was to expose Joe's murderous nature. It turns out years ago, Guinevere Beck was a teaching assistant who mentored and inspired the young Louise. Upon learning of Beck's death, supposedly at the hands of her therapist Dr. Nicky, Louise became obsessed obsessed with finding the truth. She teamed up with fellow internet sleuths, including Dr. Nicky's son Clayton, to expose Joe as Beck's real killer. Unfortunately, while getting to know Joe as Bronte, Louise began to understand him and form genuine feelings for him. And as Clayton began taking his violent obsession for justice out on Louise, she found comfort in Joe. And so Louise chooses to embrace her identity as Bronte and tells the police that Joe killed Clayton in self-defense, clearing Joe's name. Despite Joe being freed from jail, he is distraught to discover that Kate has tricked him into signing over full custody of Henry to her. A desperate Joe begins to unravel, traumatizing Henry after breaking into Teddy's house to see him, leading to Kate taking Henry and fleeing to London. Joe finds comfort in Bronte, and the pair share all of their deepest thoughts and desires with each other. Wanting nothing to threaten his new life, Joe rats out Maddie to the police, who is then arrested for Reagan's murder, alongside Harrison as her accomplice. In London, Kate gets Nadia released from prison, apologizes for helping Joe frame her for murder, and then aligns to bring a permanent end to Joe Goldberg. Kate empties Joe's bank account and locks him inside the book vault, where he is confronted by not just Kate and Nadia, but a vengeful Marianne as well. As Bronte tries to free Joe, the women spurned by him attempt to get through to her, and it is Marianne who finally helps Bronte see the evil man that Joe really is. Joe then manages to escape his book vault cage and shoot Kate, mortally wounding her. Before Joe can escape, a newly released from prison Maddie locks him in the basement and sets Mooney's on fire. Thinking he is going to die, Joe confesses to the dying Kate that he had in fact killed Love Quinn and Tom Lockwood. With Kate's final breaths, she reveals that she has recorded the confession and sent it to Nadia. Before Joe can die in the fire, Bronte arrives to save him, and the pair escape together. Though he is now a wanted man, Joe believes he can escape for a new life with Bronte, but instead, Bronte pulls a gun on him and demands that he finally confess to murdering Guinevere Beck. Bronte then allows Joe a phone call with his son Henry, who admonishes his father for being a monster. Distraught over losing his son, Joe attacks Bronte and the two engage in a brutal fight that leaves them both seriously injured. As Joe flees, the police arrive to pursue him, leading Joe to go on a killing spree to evade capture. Ultimately, he is caught by Bronte, who holds him at gunpoint. Bronte reclaims her identity as Louise once again, empowering her to shoot Joe in the genitals before allowing him to be arrested to face proper justice for his crimes. In the end, Kate is revealed to have survived the fire, living at peace with a happy Henry. Teddy takes over the family business, Maddie and Harrison get their happily ever after, Nadia and Marianne finally move on from their traumas at the hands of Joe, while Joe is convicted to a lifetime behind bars, all alone until the day he dies. As for Louise, she removes all of Joe's false edits to Guinevere Beck's book and has it republished, restoring the victim's voice and ensuring that Joe's villainy will one day be completely forgotten.